A mother bear was in a challenging situation as her cub was dying. In an extraordinary act of trust, she sought aid from an unlikely source, a humble fisherman. What happened next was an unbelievable act of kindness that forever changed the fisherman's life. A massive grizzly bear lumbered out of the forest undergrowth and stopped just a few feet away from a surprised fisherman named Victor. He didn't even have the time to be scared or run for his life. With an urgent look, the bear gently placed a tiny, motionless cub before him. The cub was barely alive. Victor's heart raced as the mother bear gave him a sorrowful, pleading look, silently asking for help for her injured baby. The fisherman looked up and down a few times, his mouth agape. He had always thought an encounter with a wild bear would end in tragedy for him, especially if he was unlucky enough to meet a mother with her cub in tow. Yet the bear in front of him was not displaying any signs of aggression. She was begging for help instead, and the thought made his head spin. While Victor felt both scared and deeply moved by the helpless cub lying at his feet, he knew he couldn't ignore the situation and simply walk away. But at the same time, he wasn't sure how to help a wild bear. He had no knowledge of their anatomy beyond the fact that they were massive and rippling with muscles. What if he tried to help and only made things worse? Just then, he heard a noise in the nearby bushes. A group of poachers armed with rifles and traps appeared, laughing cruelly. They were coming for the mother bear and her cub, and their intentions were clear. They wanted the animals dead or alive. As the poachers closed in, Victor knew he had only seconds to act. The group spread out, trying to flank the bears from multiple angles. Two of them unfolded a large, heavy-duty net, preparing to throw it over the mother bear. Another poacher readied a long pole with a metal loop at the end, a snare designed to capture and restrain large animals. They didn't even acknowledge the presence of the fishermen. But without a moment's hesitation, Victor sprang into action. He grabbed his fishing rod, gripping it tightly like a weapon. "Leave them alone," he shouted. The poachers sneered, mocking his bravery, but Victor stood his ground. The mother bear watched cautiously, her protective instincts heightened by the presence of the armed men. Just as the situation seemed to reach a boiling point, one of the poachers accidentally fired his rifle. The sudden noise startled everyone. Realizing the gunfire would attract attention from rangers or hikers, the leader shouted frantic orders, and the poachers quickly scattered into the dense underbrush. As the adrenaline faded, he focused on the badly injured cub whimpering at his feet. The mother bear watched him closely, her eyes showing a mix of fear for her baby and weary gratitude toward the human who had risked himself for her family's safety. Victor gently approached the cub. He carefully picked up the tiny, fragile creature. Victor examined the tiny creature, searching for any visible injuries or clues to its ailment. To his dismay, he found a deep gash on its hind leg. Without wasting a moment, Victor carried the cub and hurried back to his cabin, the mother bear lumbering protectively beside them. When they got to the cabin, he carefully laid the cub on a soft blanket and prepared for the difficult task ahead. He gathered his limited medical supplies, a metal bowl filled with fresh water, clean strips of cloth for bandages, and a small bottle of antiseptic meant for minor injuries. As Victor knelt beside the cub, the mother bear watched from the doorway, her eyes filled with fear and hopeful trust. With gentle hands, Victor dipped a cloth into the antiseptic and applied it to the wound. The cub let out a cry of pain, and the mother bear growled, tense and watchful. Victor continued to clean and dress the wound, apologizing with each whimper from the cub. After cleaning and bandaging the cub's wound, Victor sensed that the mother bear had no intention of leaving her baby. Her strong protective instincts kept her by its side. She stayed still, her eyes following Victor's every move as he cared for her cub. As night fell, the mother bear stayed alert, ready to guard her cub through the darkness. The next morning, Victor saw that the bear hadn't moved an inch. Her eyes were still fixed on her cub, which had survived the night thanks to his care. However, letting them go was still premature. The mother bear grew restless on the third day in Victor's cabin. On the fourth morning, Victor woke up to find the doorway empty. The bear was gone, and her large paw prints led into the trees. But she hadn't abandoned her cub. At night, she would come back to check on her cub, still recovering from its infection. Sometimes the bear even returned to Victor's porch during the day, drawn by her cub's cries or scent. She would pause outside the door, trying to locate her baby. She would retreat back into the forest only after Victor carried the cub outside to reassure her. This routine continued for several days as the cub regained strength under Victor's care. The mother bear was never far away, balancing her own needs with checking on her cub. As the cub's health improved, a new challenge emerged. It had become used to Victor and seemed unwilling to return to the wild. The mother bear, sensing her cub's hesitation, would often approach the cabin, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and longing. One day, as Victor was tending to the cub, he heard a commotion outside. He peered through the window and saw a group of lost and disoriented hikers being circled by a pack of hungry wolves. Without a second thought, Victor grabbed his trusty fishing rod and rushed outside. Realizing their predicament, the hikers clung to each other in fear as the wolves closed in. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, the mother bear burst from the trees, roaring loudly and scaring the wolves away. The hikers were shocked as the bear approached, believing they had just fallen out of the frying pan into the fire. Victor quickly intervened, explaining to the hikers that the bear was not a threat, but rather their savior. In the days that followed, the cub's recovery progressed quickly. The cub was growing strong and healthy, but also becoming more resistant to returning to the wild. The mother bear watched with both happiness at her cub's recovery and sadness at its growing bond with Victor. Victor knew he couldn't keep the cub forever despite his attachment. It belonged in the wilderness, free to live as nature intended. With a heavy heart, he began reintroducing the cub to its natural habitat. He began taking the cub on short trips into the forest, letting it explore its natural home, sights, sounds, and smells. At first, the cub clung to Victor, scared and unsure of its new surroundings. But with each trip, its confidence grew, and it began venturing further and further from his side. The mother bear watched these outings closely, staying nearby to ensure her cub was safe. Victor was always aware of her presence, knowing she trusted him but never forgetting her power. Over time, the cub started to show more interest in the wild than in the cabin. It began playing with leaves and sticks, chasing butterflies, and pouncing on imaginary prey. Finally, the day came when Victor knew the cub was ready to return to its mother fully. As the sun began to set, he led the cub to the edge of the forest, where the mother bear was waiting. Victor knelt down and gently nuzzled the cub one last time, whispering words of encouragement and love. He stood back, letting the cub make the final decision to stay with him or return to the wild where it belonged. For a moment, the cub hesitated, torn between the human who had saved its life and the natural world it was born to be a part of. The mother bear approached slowly, her eyes locked on her cub. With a gentle nudge, she encouraged the cub to come with her, to return to the life it was meant to live. The cub looked back at Victor, its eyes full of trust and love. With a final glance, the cub turned away from Victor and followed its mother into the forest.